Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Pandemic Parenting Exchange. My name is Victoria Burrick, and I am the digital content producer for Pandemic Parenting. I will be helping out in the background. If you have any questions for technical stuff, feel free to reach out. And for all of your questions that you think of that deal with the content of today's webinar, drop them in the Q&A section. And we have a bit of time set aside at the end of today's webinar for Dr. Lindsay Malloy and Dr. Amanda Zelechoski to answer a few of those. We'll get to as many as we can with the time we have. With that being said, I want to thank our sponsor for today's webinar. The National Register of Health Service Psychologists is the largest nonprofit credentialing organization for licensed psychologists in the US. With approximately 10,000 members, the National Register's consumer website, findapsychologist.org, features thousands of psychologist profiles plus healthcare blogs, podcasts, and self-help resources. Thank you, National Register, for sponsoring today's webinar. I would like to introduce our two panelists. Dr. Amanda Zelechoski is a clinical and forensic psychologist and associate professor of psychology at Valparaiso University. And Dr. Lindsay Malloy is a developmental and forensic psychologist and an associate professor at Ontario Tech University. You can read more about them and their backgrounds on our website. With that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Okay, thanks, Victoria, and thank you everybody for being here for our second webinar. One of our goals with having a moderator is to actually amplify emerging scholars and early career people in our field. And so with that in mind, I'm excited to introduce our moderator for tonight, Lillian Rodriguez. Lillian received her BA in psychology from the University of Toledo in 2016. And then luckily for me, she decided to come to Ontario Tech University, and she is a PhD student for the last couple of years in my lab at Ontario Tech, the Development, Context, and Communication Lab. So thank you, Lillian, for doing this, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here tonight. Thank you for those kind words, Lindsay. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started by giving just a brief overview of what we'll be covering this evening. So first, we're going to be talking about parent-child conversations in general and what purposes they serve, for example. And then we're going to be sharing some of our brand new findings from our studies on COVID-19 and families. And finally, we'll focus on some specific how-tos, some basic simple tips that you can try with your child maybe tomorrow when they wake up. So to go ahead and get our discussion started this evening, Lindsay, our study was specifically focused on parent-child conversations about the pandemic. Do you want to start us off by sharing why we chose to focus on that particular issue?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good starting spot. So we know from research and from, intuitively just being parents ourselves, and even if we think back to being kids ourselves, that parents are really important sources of information and of emotional support for kids. So they look to us as parents for cues in terms of how they should feel about things and, what's an appropriate reaction for learning about the world. And, what's important about this event? What should I remember about it? And this is true for teens as well, although for teens, they have that increase in peer orientation and, peers become increasingly important to them as sources of support and information. But nonetheless, even for teens, parents remain an extremely important influence. So we have this situation now where a lot of kids and teenagers are cut off from other sources of support and information that they would typically have in their lives, like teachers and coaches and, friends and other kind of very important people in their lives. And so we have arguably an even increasingly important role for parents to fill. There's also not a lot of research in this area. So when we were starting our study, we were looking for, parent-child conversations and what they might mean in this particular area. So we found a study that was done in 2009 in the Netherlands that looked at Dutch children's fears of the H1N1 swine flu. And there they found that parents' fears of H1N1 were related to children's fears of the virus. And so that suggested that maybe there was something about parents' behavior or the way they were communicating about their kids about H1N1 that led to those greater fears. But we just really don't know very much. So we wanted to launch our study focused on that. Yeah.
All right, so then Amanda, how can parent-child conversations help children cope with the ongoing stress of the pandemic?
Yeah, this pandemic is stressful for sure. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today really works for talking about any negative or traumatic experience for kids, not just the ongoing pandemic. So I encourage you to sort of think about this beyond the context of just our current situation, which hopefully will not be our situation for very long. But as parents, again, as Lindsay said, we're often the ones sharing our knowledge with our kids and also hopefully offering them the social and emotional support that they need. So there actually is a fair bit of research showing that children are affected by how parents react, what they say about stressful events, and that actually preparing kids for stressful events, which often involves informing them, giving them knowledge about what to expect, that doing those things can lower their anxiety such that they then show less distress during things like really difficult medical procedures, or, in Lindsay's and my world, often preparing kids to testify in court. So doing things that help to prepare them so they know what to expect can really decrease the likelihood of that distress. So helping them to understand what to expect, it reduces the uncertainty, it can reduce the stress. But now, even given that, informing them and offering support, it's important to remember, is different than doing things like what we call in psychology ruminating, right? So kind of obsessing over it again and again and, bringing it up again and again if our children aren't seeming distressed by it. So offering support, offering information is different than that kind of repetitive rumination or obsessing over it, which actually is not particularly helpful to kids. But talking to kids about what's going on, and again, like I said, preparing them really can be quite helpful.
Okay, so then Lindsay, is there a risk of parents traumatizing their children by bringing up the subject of COVID-19? Would it maybe be better if they avoided the topic altogether?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely one that I've heard before. And parents, they might be concerned, and I totally get that, about bringing up something that's quite distressing. Is this going to make it worse for my kids? And that goes for any difficult subject. Any sort of natural disaster or event of terrorism, that kind of thing. But we know enough from research in these other areas that actually the opposite can be true. So failing to bring it up, failing to discuss it, can actually have some negative consequences and make it more difficult for kids. So, for example, Jonathan Comer, who is one of the collaborators on our project, actually, on COVID-19, he's done a lot of work on children's reactions to and coping with disasters and terrorism. So he did some really great studies around the time of the Boston Marathon bombing. And what he found was that it was actually the parents who avoided talking about the Boston Marathon bombing with their kids, and the parents who told other people, look, don't bring this up around my kid, I don't want you talking about it with them. Those were the kids who actually had more post-traumatic stress symptoms than parents kids who had parents who did engage in these kinds of conversations with them. So it did depend a little bit on the children's ages, and we'll talk about age quite a bit tonight. But the important take home here is that at least when it comes to other kinds of disasters and events that we have a lot of research on, avoiding the topic is not helpful. So children are going to hear things, they're going to see things in the media, and they will talk to friends, so they need that parent input and influence. Of course, you've probably been having these conversations because this has been going on for a few months now. Obviously, you will have talked to them already about it, but there's a lot of things changing about it. There's new information all the time. So these conversations will need to be kind of an ongoing thing.
Yeah, that actually reminds me, just to sort of piggyback off that, it's kind of similar to what we know from the research about, when we talk with kids about other really difficult topics, that's a question I get asked all the time is, if I'm worried about my child having suicidal thoughts or experimenting with sexual behavior or drugs or alcohol, like I just shouldn't bring it up. I don't want to put ideas in their heads. And actually, we know a lot from research about how important it is, in fact, to talk with kids about these difficult topics. So in most cases, even though we might feel ambivalent or want to avoid that or it's uncomfortable, In most cases, not only is it okay to ask, it's actually really important to do so, because you don't want to make assumptions about what your kids are thinking or feeling, or assumptions about what they know or don't know. So having these conversations is just really critical, especially around some of these more sensitive or difficult topics we might be inclined to want to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So given the importance of having these types of conversations, what do these conversations that parents and children are having about COVID-19 look like? Lindsay, do we have any insights from the data yet?
Yeah, so we do have some sort of like a preliminary peek at the data, which I'm excited about. And Lillian, I don't think you've even seen this yet. So this is very exciting because you put a lot of work into this project. And so Victoria very kindly helped, she did make some slides that are really quite nice. And so I'll just talk a little bit. Again, this is preliminary stuff. This isn't even our whole sample, but just some general patterns that we saw. So, and keep in mind, this is right at the start of the pandemic in North America. So we're talking about like late March here. Common topics that parents were talking about with their kids. Hand washing and proper hand washing techniques, germs and how to prevent their spread. And this is kind of back when we thought we could just have a couple of weeks of washing our hands really good and not touching our face and everything would be, completely fine. So think, kind of remember back to that. Importance of social distancing and distancing from friends and family. These were the things that came up a lot. Less often parents mention things like potentially experiencing racism or discrimination in relation to COVID-19, the symptoms of what their kids should be looking for, probably because they didn't really feel an immediate threat yet, because this was, again, at the beginning, how other people were reacting to COVID-19. So I'm excited to get some of this, some of the follow-up data that we're going to collect soon, because I think we will have seen some shifts in the kinds of things people are talking about. But this was early on, some of the things, the general topics. And then we have pulled some fun quotes from some of the kids in the study. So I completely, I'm on the same level with these kids. So I hate coronavirus. I wish it would go away. I hate the stupid coronavirus and it's not fair. So these are kids, 6, 10, and 10, and just their kind of general feelings about it. Now, these are parents reporting what their kids are saying. So keep that in mind, not us interviewing the kids themselves. Children were also expressing a lot of fears in our study, and this was kids of all ages. From our study went from 5 up to age 17. So they're talking about, proximity to themselves. Like, is it in our neighborhood? Is it in our state or our province? Are my parents going to get it? Are my grandparents going to get it? And most notably, maybe bringing up fears of death of themselves or someone that they care about. Again, a lot of times that was grandparents. From the youngest ages right up to the oldest, people were wondering when it would all be over, which unfortunately we're kind of still wondering that. But, when will it be over? When will the parks open? How long is school going to be closed? So when are things going to go back to normal? And the things that they're going to do when things go back to normal, when it stops virusing, as my 3-year-old says. We can do that when it stops virusing. Yeah, so then the younger kids, like roughly 10 and under or so, as we would expect, they're pretty focused on the here and now and the immediate impact of the virus and how it's affecting themselves and the things that they care about, like playgrounds and family and friends, and am I going to get to have a birthday party? Whereas adolescents, the tweens and teens in our sample, we're talking more like big picture kind of stuff. They were expressing some pretty complex, fears about, well, what happens if the virus mutates? They're focused on other people's behavior and, why aren't people following the rules? Why aren't people complying with what they're supposed to do to stop the spread? And they're focused on things like, the global impact and the impact on the economy. So there's a lot of different things that kids were bringing up, but it was really interesting to just take that first sneak peek and see what parents are saying their kids are worried about and how that looks different for different ages. Yeah.
Yeah, so along those lines, you mentioned that some of the trends in the data suggest that age is going to be important here to consider. Can you give insight as to why things might look different based on age?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I was just listening though and looking at some of those quotes that Lindsay was sharing, and they were so consistent with the ages of my kids too, what you're finding in your data. And my little guy also routinely talks about, I hate the coronavirus. I just want to go back to school. And so, that's what we heard a lot. So it's interesting. So let's stay with this, different developmental stages piece. So I'm going to kind of do my best to summarize all of developmental psych in the next minute or two, just to kind of give you a sense of why both Lindsay and I in our respective studies and many of our colleagues are seeing these differences across ages, okay, and the way that kids talk about things related to COVID-19. So children and teens are concerned about very different things, okay? They have different cognitive capabilities, different psychosocial levels of maturity, and so the conversations are going to look different with kids of different ages. So I just wanted to note also that as there are various things we're talking about, Victoria's putting resources in the chat box. If you haven't navigated your way there, I encourage you to do so. We'll also be posting many of these resources and more on our website when we post all the resources from tonight's webinar. So just, keep an eye on the great things that she's posting there and that we'll be including for you later as well. So as you saw in those examples that Lindsay just showed us, there's a lot more sophistication and sort of nuance to kids' understanding about COVID the older they get. You saw that in those quotes. So some of this has to do with the types of fears that we typically see at each age or developmental stage. So you can see now, I want to talk just through these briefly, the differences in normal types of fears you might see in kids of different ages. So for babies and toddlers, ages 0 to 2, this is a theme you're going to see across a lot of these ages. Being separated from parents is a major fear for kids at this stage. They're afraid of strangers, loud noises, or kind of sensory overload, and costumes. Any of you who have had infants, you know what that's like when your little one, sees somebody in a big costume that's supposed to be fun and they're terrified. So that's a really common fear at that stage. For preschoolers, ages 3 and 4, again, separation from parents. They're often afraid of animals, like dogs, for example. They're afraid of the dark, any loud or scary noises. If there are changes or shifts in routines, so by that I mean things like if you get a pretty significant haircut, you change your hair color, maybe you shave your beard, that can actually really freak your kiddo out, right? If you look different and they're just trying to sort of make sense of who you are and what this change is. So those are common fears for preschoolers. For early school age kids, ages 5 to 6, again, being separated from parents still is a pretty significant fear at that time. They're worried about making grown-ups upset or getting in trouble. They're worried about getting sick or hurt. They would talk a lot about bad guys or bad people, and having bad dreams, right? Because it's still hard for them at this time to know what's real or what's not, what's in their imagination and what's not. That's why they're afraid of things like monsters, right, in their dreams. So if we kind of continue on and think about older kids, so when we're talking about ages 7 to 11, sudden tragedies or crises tend to be a significant fear, a parent getting sick or dying, sometimes being at home alone, and definitely that fear of rejection by peers and how their peers might be judging them. For adolescents, still being judged by peers is really significant. They're worried about themselves or somebody they care about getting hurt. Failing in school, current events they're aware of that are going on around them. They're worried about how that might impact them. So things like school shootings, for example. Talking to parents about personal issues, they get afraid of that. What are my parents going to think if I tell them this? And they definitely are afraid of missing out on major things or things that they think are really important or significant. So if we keep these fears in mind at different stages, it definitely plays into the kinds of conversations we're going to have with our kids of different ages. So how then do kids of different ages talk about and understand COVID? What can we expect? What should we expect in these conversations? So we wanted to kind of give you some examples. And so we talked to some kids of different ages to try and get a sense of how this looks across ages. So what I'm going to share with you now is a clip of a 4-year-old. Okay, and this clip is especially for Claire, who wrote to us specifically asking for help with talking to a 4-year-old. And I empathize greatly, and I know Lindsay did because we both have kids around that age. So, we're going to play this clip now for you of this 4-year-old and just try to listen and understand the degree to which you think this child understands what COVID is and how he's talking about it.
What is the coronavirus?
I don't know.
What do you think it is?
I don't know.
Is it something you eat?
That means you will die.
It means you will die? How come?
Because the coronavirus has poison ivy.
Has poison ivy. How does it make people die?
With you touching a different grown-up.
Oh, if you touch a grown-up. So how do we stay safe from the coronavirus?
Without touching any of your cousins. But after coronavirus, you can touch any whatever people you want.
After the coronavirus?
And you can touch every person you want.
Okay.
Or one if you want it.
So as is often the case with 4-year-olds, you have to simultaneously give them something to chow down on while you are asking them these questions. So you can see in that example, right in there, of how preschoolers are very egocentric. They're mostly concerned about how something is going to affect them and their lives. And you can see in the kinds of questions I was asking that they tend to need more adult assistance, or what we call scaffolding, to be able to talk about things and to regulate their emotions while they're talking about them. And later on, Lindsay and I will get into the kinds of questions that we asked in these examples and whether those were sort of, the best way to ask the questions, or whether there might have been different ways to do that, okay? So that's an example of a 4-year-old, okay? So now let's listen to a clip from an 8-year-old.
Tell me what you know about coronavirus.
I know that it's really dangerous, and if you go near someone who has it, you might get it, so that's why everyone's staying 6 feet away.
What do you mean dangerous? You said dangerous.
Everyone, I mean dangerous. What I mean by dangerous is, if you get it, there's 75% chance you could die. So, that's what I mean.
Where did you hear that?
Nowhere, I just knew it.
Oh, yeah? Did somebody teach you that, or did you hear it somewhere?
I heard it somewhere.
Okay. So 75% chance you could die, huh?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
I think that I should stay 6 feet away if I don't have a mask on.
So you hear some fear and some very concrete thinking in there, right? So he was talking in extremes, and he had this sort of need for precision. So if you get it, you will die. I need to stay 6 feet away if I don't have a mask. Very concrete need to understand the world in that level of specificity. So the last clip I want to share with you now is from a 14-year-old. And this clip is a bit longer, but we wanted you to be able to hear the sophistication and sort of nuance that an older child starts to have around what coronavirus means. So here is that clip.
It would be like.
Yeah.
How do you think coronavirus is going to change the world?
I think everybody's going to be a lot more cautious and a lot more, take a lot more precautions when it comes to, going outside and stuff, because nobody really knew what the coronavirus was before this, if it was a thing. I don't know, but everybody's going to be kind of, I think, on edge, waiting for something else to happen. Kind of that thing, that sort of thing.
Is that how it feels for you right now?
Yeah, because stuff just keeps happening. I don't know if it's the year or what, but stuff just keeps happening this year. And it's just you're waiting for the next thing to happen.
What does that feel like for you? Waiting for the next thing to happen?
It's kind of nerve-wracking because you don't know if it's going to be how the murder hornets were, where it's just going to go away. Because those never actually happened. They were just told about. Or it's going to be a long-lasting thing like the coronavirus. So yeah.
Tell me what questions you have about coronavirus or things that you wonder about.
Like, I don't know. Like, how do people get over it?
It would be like,
Yeah.
how do you think coronavirus is going to change the world?
I think everybody's going to be a lot more.
I think that's okay, Victoria. That's good. So you can hear the concerns there are broadened, right? She's worried about the world. She's worried about how COVID is impacting others, how it's impacting society. She's talking about other current events like murder hornets. She's able to take others' perspectives, think about sort of the collective impact of the choices other people are making, the combined impact of all of these different things going on in the world. And she also verbalized this like sense of impending doom. Things just keep happening. We're all on edge, which means she has a sense of what's happening in the community beyond just what's happening in her world. So that is a much more sophisticated sort of understanding and ability to hold a lot of these ideas than we have seen with the younger ages. And so, which is consistent, right? Teens tend to be much more peer-oriented. They are thinking about their social context. They're thinking about things like, how will this affect my friends? How is this going to impact maybe social events that are really important to me? And so the ways that they are trying to understand COVID right now are quite different than, again, we saw with some of those younger ages.
Absolutely. So regarding preparing for these conversations, Lindsay, how should parents go about raising this subject with their children? Is there a right way to do that?
Yeah, I'm sure parents, obviously, they've done it quite a lot already. I wouldn't say there's a right way to do it, but there are some tips that might help you, moving forward as you continue to have these conversations. One would be just kind of creating space for those conversations to occur. And there's a bug flying in my face right now, sorry. Creating that space, and that might even mean like a physical space. So conversations that you have with your child, like in the car or when you're laying, next to them in bed, those can be kind of good places. Potentially, they may allow your child to, not have to make eye contact with you when they bring something up, which, that might be a little bit less intense, more relaxed for them to bring up something that's uncomfortable for them to talk about. And it also hides your facial expressions, which can be beneficial in case they say something, that's worrisome or shocking to you. Every conversation does not need to be a formal kind of sit down and let's talk about X or Y, but it can just be something casual, when you're driving in the car. If you have more than one child, you're probably going to want to think about how you can create a space to talk to children individually, because there might be things that they want to express that they don't really want their sibling to overhear. Demonstrating availability is really important. So, as adults, we may have kind of gotten used to everything. COVID-19 is sort of old news at this point, and we think that children don't need to talk about it anymore. Although we've already explained it, we've already explained why we're social distancing. But checking in regularly, asking them, tell me what you've heard lately, or just giving them an opportunity to talk about it. Reminding them that you're there to talk and to answer their questions. And especially for the little kids, initiating those conversations. So for the younger ones, they may need you to actually initiate and give them the opportunity to talk more so than the older kids. Those are just a couple kind of basic tips.
I just want to piggyback on one thing Lindsay said when you were describing, answering the questions again and again, like being available. It was just making me think about the different kind of fluctuation for parents and kids throughout all of this, right? It may be like in the beginning, we were really good at, let's sit down and talk about this and make space for it and, be available. But then as we, as parents, became really weary, it starts to get kind of frustrating and tiring to answer the same questions. But we have to remember that our kids also have these kind of short-term memories, and they're seeking reassurance a lot of times by the way they ask questions. So even though you're maybe sick of reading about it, talking about it, thinking about it, when they come up to you and ask a question, we have to be mindful of, they don't know that I've been consumed by this. And so it's just that it's not always in sync when you're ready to talk about it and when they want to talk about it. And so we have to be like tracking that and mindful of that.
Okay. So just along that same line of thinking, Amanda, do you recommend having these conversations as a family unit or more one-on-one individual?
So I think it's important to acknowledge that all families are different, right? So even when we're just talking about what a family unit is, that means different things for all of us, okay? That can mean a two-parent home, it can mean a single-parent home, it can mean, you know, a co-parented where the child lives in several different homes. It can mean children and parents and extended families that all live together. And so, you know, whatever that might mean, recognizing that families are different, and so that's a part of how we, you know, decide the best way to do these conversations is let's think about the constellation of my own family. Like I always have these images in my mind of sitting down for family meetings, right? Like in all those 90s sitcoms I used to watch, that we would like sit down and have our family meeting to resolve this issue. And then that really like nice emotional soundtrack will start playing, and we will decide the stuff we have to decide as a family. But I think most of you would agree, like that's not really how it happens. And when I have tried to call family meetings, it fails miserably. So there may be some conversations where I think, you know, Lindsay was alluding to this. It's actually much more appropriate and makes sense to have those conversations individually. There may be some where a family meeting makes sense and we need to sit down and, you know, maybe we're setting rules as a family, or we're deciding on how a schedule is going to work or something like that. There can be conversations that make sense to do in that collective way. But many of these conversations sometimes make more sense to do individually, to recognize in some ways, like we talked about in the first pandemic parenting exchange webinar around school risk assessment, to make your decisions individually for individual children rather than collectively for my children as a unit. This can go the same way, that you want to think about each child as an individual. Think about their age, some of these things that Lindsay and I have been talking about to factor in at different ages or developmental stages. Think about, even aside from age, what about that child's sort of individual temperament or coping style? Like, do I have sort of that anxious, rule-abiding child that I need to talk to about certain things in this way? Or maybe I have a child who tests the boundaries more or is more of a risk taker, and so I need to talk about some of the things we need to do and think about in this way. And so again, really trying to meet them where they are and have the conversations that make sense for their individual personalities, temperament, character traits, those kinds of things. That just might dictate how we have these conversations with them and what we need to emphasize. And I know Lindsay and I have talked about, you know, we've had to have very different conversations with our different children, you know, for many of these reasons because of their temperaments.
Yeah, I have kind of a cute story if we have a second, with my older one who was 4 when this all started and is now 5. But you know, he is the cautious kid, the safety, you know, rule abiding. And right when this was all beginning, I was talking a lot about washing your hands and the importance of that. And every time they came in the house, like, you have to wash your hands. And you know, kind of forgetting, like, what kid do I have? You know, who is my kid, and what are his normal, you know, behaviors? And so there were a few times right at the beginning where he woke up in the middle of the night, came into my room crying, and said he had to wash his hands. It was like 2 in the morning because he just touched his face when he woke up in his sleep, and he wanted to wash his hands because he touched his face, and he knew that rule. You know, you're not supposed to touch your face, and, you know, wash your hands. So that really was an eye-opener for me, like, okay, I have to dial it back a little bit with him because, you know, maybe I'm getting through a bit too much. And so, yeah, just think about, you know, and even today I hear him, he's counting to 20 diligently every time he washes his hands. You know, I can hear him in the other room. So I know I don't have to harp on about that as much, but maybe that wouldn't be the case for another kid who needs those reminders.
Yeah, I was just thinking, gosh, can you get my kid to count to 20? Because, man, we've tried everything.
Well, every time he does it, yes. What number am I supposed to count to again? So it does take that, but, you know, he does at least remember to do it.
Oh, man. If we could get to 5, I'd call it a win without me standing there.
Okay, so let's shift gears here and move into those how-tos, those specific little basic tips and simple tips that we can take with us tonight. So Lindsay, what are some of the basic things that parents can do to have a conversation with their kids about COVID-19 in ways that aren't going to be traumatizing to them or, you know, keep them up at night?
Right. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a few general things you can do, and I'm going to borrow very heavily from the research that I typically do, which is on forensic interviewing of children when we think something bad may have happened to them, or they need to be interviewed about potential abuse, for example. But change it up a bit, obviously. But these are some things that have been shown to be really effective in that context, and they could work for parents too. So showing support. So this can be verbal and nonverbal support. Smiling, if it's appropriate and it matches what they're talking about. Having an open body posture, not crossing your arms when you're talking to them, just being open, warm, approachable, even leaning forward, making eye contact, trying not to seem distracted, put down your phone if you're talking about something serious. And I am definitely not one of the kind of parent shaming about screen time, and especially when I've noticed for myself now that the kids have been home for several months and my work days are all chopped up and weird, and I'm trying to do work while they're doing things, that, it's very hard to not be answering a quick email all the time, or, that separation from work and home is just, it doesn't exist anymore. And so that's tough, but, try to put that down and really focus if they're trying to talk to you about something. Use what we call facilitators. So things like, okay, head nodding. These types of things indicate that you're engaged in what they're saying, but they don't offer any kind of input. They're not you changing the conversation or adding to it. They're just kind of encouraging them to keep talking. And actually research shows that these sorts of things are linked with children providing longer and more detailed reports when it comes to forensic interviewing. They also encourage kids to share their feelings when they're having those kinds of discussions. So think about trying to show that you're engaged by using those facilitators. Minimize negative reactions. So, don't try not to look shocked or horrified when they say something, or, don't, laugh even if they say something really adorable. If, they're expressing a fear that they have, try not to minimize it by saying, oh, you don't have to be worried about that. Or in 5 years, you're not even going to care about the prom. This is a really big deal to them now. So try not to just dismiss, their feelings or their fears. Don't interrupt them. This is, it's very distracting, disrupts their train of thought. I see it all the time in forensic interviews though, where, it's conveying to the child, like, what I have to say is important, not what you have to say. And you really want them to be in control and sharing. And there's almost nothing that's going to shut down the conversation faster than, repeatedly interrupting a child. Like, even my three-year-old is always telling her older brother, like, you're interrupting me. She is not a fan. And so really try not to do that. It's very frustrating and aggravating. And like I said, you're going to disrupt their train of thought and derail that conversation. Be okay with silences and pauses. And this is something I have to work on a lot, but I know when we would do research with kids, I would ask a question and we do have to sit there for like 30 seconds, which feels like an eternity. And you think, oh, this kid didn't understand the question, or, they're not going to provide me with an answer. And then suddenly they give you a response that made total sense. And it's just, they're just thinking and processing, and their processing is slower than ours. So give them a chance and don't feel like you have to be like jumping in and peppering them with more questions if they don't respond right away. And I think just one more would be reminding children that it's okay to say, I don't know, or to say that they don't understand. There's lots of research, and this is some of Lillian's dissertation work actually, that shows that children will not tell us when they don't understand a question. They just think that, an adult asks me a question and I'm supposed to answer it, especially the younger kids. And so making sure they know that it's okay to say, I don't know, I don't understand. Yeah, I think Victoria's going to post some resources too on some of these ideas.
Yes, I see that going into the chat right now. So for you, Amanda, are there specific questions that parents should be asking?
Yeah, so how much do your children know, I think, is a great place to start, right? Like I talked a little while ago about how we sometimes make assumptions about what they know. We think they know certain things. We also want to know where they're getting their information from. So you heard, for example, in the clip of the 8-year-old, where he cited 75% likelihood of death. And so, I was asking those follow-up questions, like, where did you learn that? And did you hear that somewhere? And, trying to really understand, like, where is he getting his information from? To just get a sense of what they know, and is that consistent with what we thought they knew about it. So some of that can help us get at their misperceptions so that we're able to then correct them. And interestingly, I know, one of the things Lindsay and I have been talking about is just how this can also lead to some other really important areas, like having some anti-racism conversations with your kids, right? So we know that, for example, there's evidence of increased racism against Asian Americans as a result of COVID-19. And so kids might have wildly incorrect views about how the virus started or where it came from, that we can be a part of the solution in terms of correcting that, and the hopes that we're decreasing these sorts of incidents and making sure our kids are not, a part of that, or contributing to conversations or spreading rumors or really just misinformation. So it's important to understand what they know, where they're getting their information from, and work to correct misperceptions that they might have. So it's not always thinking about specifics to ask, or just, am I asking the right question? But sometimes it's actually really helpful to encourage them to ask you questions. So let them know that option is always there. Questions like, are there things you're confused? Tell me things you're confused about with COVID, or what else would you like to know? What have you been wondering? What are you worried about? Answer their questions then, of course, in developmentally appropriate ways. And one of the things I think we have to be careful of in that context is to not give them more information than they need. Just address their question, or maybe give them an example to try to demonstrate what it is they're asking about. So we're going to post some question prompts in the resources section of the website, but we're going to give you some specific tips on ways to form these questions. Oh, Victoria's sharing them now, which is awesome. Thank you. So things like, tell me what you know about the virus. Tell me what you've heard about the virus. How do you feel about what's happening with coronavirus? What are you and your friends talking about in terms of COVID? That's a really great one for teenagers, for high schoolers. What have you and your friends been saying? Like, what have you guys heard? Remembering that for teenagers, it's all about sort of that peer dynamic, and that's where they're getting their information from often. What do you mean by, you heard me do that with the 8-year-old when he said dangerous. What do you mean by dangerous? How long have you been feeling such and such? Tell me some things at school that were the same, tell me some things that were different. And then what are some things, this last one is really about helping to empower your child and help them take back some control. What are some things we can do to stay safe? What are some things we can do to feel better about this? So collaborate together on, some solutions you might be able to generate within your family.
Okay, and then beyond that, Lindsay, are there questioning techniques that you would recommend?
Yeah, so again, stealing from the forensic interviewing literature, and you saw some of the examples that Amanda just gave where she's using lots of tell me, and that's a very kind of quintessential thing from the forensic interviewing literature. Don't say, can you tell me? Say, tell me. There's a slight difference there, but you don't risk the child saying, well, no, or at least it's less of a risk. So using an open-ended approach, right? Asking these invitation type questions. Tell me what you've heard. Tell me what you think. Even preschoolers can answer these kinds of open-ended questions. The research shows in our field. And so we can ask those of preschoolers. Now, they might not give us very much, but we can then build on that using what's called cued invitations. So you said X, tell me more about X. Or earlier you mentioned Y, tell me everything about that. And remarkably, children can give a lot more information, but usually what happens is we ask them an open-ended prompt, like, tell me what happened, or tell me what you know about coronavirus. And they don't give us very much, so we just leap into using lots of yes-no questions and like peppering them with lots of yes-no questions. And you're not going to get as much out of them then. And so trying to build on that by just saying, practice that. It's like a formula. You said blah, 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 blah. Tell me more about that. Or you said blah, 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 blah. How do you feel about that? You may actually have to, especially for the younger ones, explicitly prompt them to talk about emotion. They know emotion terms, they can talk about emotions, but they often won't spontaneously bring them up. So you might have to actually ask them to, how did you feel when, such and such happened? And try to avoid using leading or suggestive questions. I know we're not asking children to testify when it comes to this, talking about COVID or other, things you might be talking to your child about, but still ask them, how are you feeling, rather than, are you scared? Are you sad? Are you scared? Are you nervous about starting school? You know, because you're sort of like, well, should I be nervous? Should I be scared? Should I be worried? My mom's asking me this, you know, so watch how you're framing it, and kind of where you're leading them. It's okay to affirm, like, oh, you said you feel sad about missing your friends. I miss my friends too. Or you said you feel sad about missing your friends. How can we, you know, help you better connect with them during this time? So yeah, Victoria's going to share some resources there that are specifically about talking to your kids about going back to school. And I thought there were some great little scripts in that article, because for me, I need someone to give me like the exact examples, you know, give me the script so that when I get confronted with a situation that's going to come up, that I just kind of know and I have my go-to. So that article has some good ones in there. And then I'm just looking at the time. I wonder if we should jump to the Q&A so we have some time to get to those. What do you think?
Yeah, I think let's just do this one more topic, just because it's one that actually was a Q&A in a lot of the emails.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so let's just do this one, because I know a bunch of people had this question. So.
Yeah, so this question, Amanda, is about what we should do when a kid asks a question that we were not prepared for.
Yeah, we got that question from a lot of parents over the last week or so, that sometimes I don't want to bring this stuff up because I'm afraid I'm not going to know the answer. I'm not going to, answer the question the right way, or I'm going to give wrong information. So we know that one of the fears parents have is that they won't know how to answer questions their kids ask. And so what we want to tell you today is, like, it is okay to not know. Of course, we don't know the answers to a lot of these questions. Especially right now in the pandemic, there's just not necessarily the answers out there to be had. But there are some ways that you might answer in these situations. So maybe saying something like, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm not sure anybody does. I do know that there are lots of really hardworking doctors and scientists out there in the world trying to understand this issue, though. Or something like, that's an interesting question, and I actually don't know the answer, but I wonder how we might be able to find that out together. And then you're empowering your child to work with you on, here's how we can go research something like that to find the answer. Also, remember that you don't have to get it right the first time. So give yourself some permission and grace to go back and do it again if you need to. So this happens to me all the time, that I'll sort of answer on the fly because I panic and I'm caught off guard. I wasn't expecting that question, but then I'll sort of think about it overnight and come back to my child and say, how you asked me about COVID yesterday, and I'm not sure that I explained that well. Can I try again? And then we just have the conversation again. It's okay to acknowledge that. It's okay to apologize to your kids if you got the answer wrong, and not just in this situation, but in other situations too. It normalizes and sort of models the importance of acknowledging when we're wrong or when we don't have an answer, or just apologizing in general, and helps kids know that, I know, shock, your parents aren't perfect either and don't always know the answer to everything. So I think, and I guess the last thing there is, sometimes when people panic because they don't know how to answer their child's question, and this can be especially the case with older kids, right? High schoolers, young adults, that they're asking really tough questions, that we shut it down because we're sort of afraid. And so if you feel like you didn't know how to answer right away, I just encourage you not to shut that down, or don't be afraid to engage again. Like, jump back in there and try again, because we're allowed to have do-overs. I think that's sort of just what parenting is, right? Isn't it just a bunch of trial and error over and over again, hoping that we get it right at some point? So don't be afraid to come back and revisit the conversation if you didn't feel like you were prepared in the first go round.
Definitely, and about all sorts of things. I had that happen about, 3 months ago with my older one, who, like I said, just turned 5, and he started asking me questions about death, and I was completely not prepared for it at all. And I can't even remember what I said to him at the time, but then I ordered a book on talking to young kids about this, and looked at it, and I kind of was able to come back and rectify that situation, I think. We'll see.
Yeah.
But anyway.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into the Q&A portion. So Victoria already mentioned this in the chat, but if you do have a question for us, go ahead and drop that into the Q&A board down below. And just one other thing before we move into those questions, Victoria is also going to post a link for our brief 1-minute feedback survey. So if you have an opportunity to provide some feedback for our team to let us know what we did and what we didn't do right, go ahead and fill that out for us. We really appreciate that. So let's move into the questions. And go ahead and feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A. Just to get us started, Amanda and Lindsay, do you have any advice on talking to kids about going back to school specifically? This one has come up quite a bit for us.
Yeah, and that's one that, sorry, I had to make sure my mic was still on, that I've been thinking about quite a bit because, that's coming up for us. And I started thinking, and I was like, oh, it's the 3 Ps. And I felt very proud of myself when I figured that out. So positive, prepare, and practice are the things that I'm trying to do with my kids. So focusing on the positive, whether they're the positive things about going back to school or the positive things about remote learning, if that's what you'll be doing, but focusing on the things that are going to be good about that and preparing them. So practicing wearing masks, if that's something that your child is going to be doing, talking about the things that might look different this year, the things that will, that might look the same, doing a dry run if you can. So actually, practicing doing the drop off, and, it's been several months now since kids have been in school. And so, they might need kind of a reminder. I mean, mine was barely in school before all of this happened. So even remembering where it was. And just remember that, they're probably going to have a wide range of emotions about starting school, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't unmuted, sorry. So is it okay for parents to get emotional in these conversations?
Oh my gosh, yes, I definitely think so. I mean, be authentic, be human, you're modeling for your children, that it's okay to feel these things. They're confused about what they're supposed to feel. I think we're confused about what we're supposed to feel about all of this. And, this is actually a great time for us to sort of plug our conversation for the next Pandemic Parenting Exchange, which will be around grief and the things that our kids have lost in this process, the things we as parents have lost, and the things we collectively sort of as a community have lost. And so I know that that's been something that parents that I've talked with have just really struggled with, like naming and understanding that, yeah, we're just really sad. But I'm trying to be upbeat and positive because I don't, want my children to see that. And I also think it's okay to just authentically talk about, hey, I'm sad too. I know you miss your friends. I miss my friends too. Or I know you were really looking forward to the prom. I was really looking forward to that for you too. And so to be able to talk about that is fantastic, and it's authentic, and it's showing your kids that there are ways to feel these things and that it's okay to feel these things. Now, that being said, I would also just sort of caution you not to go overboard. Like, there are things that I've definitely felt and probably grieved maybe even more than my kids. So it's not helpful if they're doing okay with something for me to say every day, gosh, I'm so sad that you can't be back in school with your friends today. Like, I'm just so sad that you're doing this over Zoom instead of in person. I mean, that is not helpful if they are actually doing okay with it. So yes, it's okay to get emotional. It's okay to be authentic, but be mindful of, tracking where they are and not sort of going overboard in how you're feeling about something and kind of burdening them with that in that moment.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So we have one in the chat here from Kathleen. So in regards to sharing the facts with an older child, what if the facts are very grim? Is it less likely to cause anxiety to not be very direct in your answer, or is it better to present the facts in an age-appropriate way?
That is a tough question. I think, and Amanda, you can correct me if I'm wrong or kind of weigh in here too. I think cautious honesty is probably warranted. And it totally depends on the age of the child. But if they're, in the teenage years or, getting close to that, chances are they're seeing some of the news media themselves. So they're aware of, the number of fatalities that are like banner across every news program. And so there's no sense kind of hiding those details from them. I don't think you have to bring them up, but if they're asking questions, you can give them the information that they need while also reassuring them about all the things that your family is doing to keep them safe, and the different ways that other people are working to keep them safe. Amanda, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I like that term, cautious honesty. It made me wonder, when Kathleen noted grim details, like what do we mean by grim, and being mindful of that, and again, so much of this has to do with the child's age and what would be developmentally appropriate. But I mean, the reality is many of us have lost family members in this. People have lost jobs. Like there have just been some really serious repercussions. And they hear us talking about that as parents, they see our distress. And so I think especially, again, just tracking how old they are, if you have a family member who's dying because of complications with COVID, do you need to spell out the grim, as the term that Kathleen used, details of that in this, very traumatic way? Of course not. But do I want to hide the fact that there's a likelihood that, we may lose grandpa? And so let's talk about what that means. And is he safe right now? And who is taking care of him? And answer their questions. And this is where I go back to what Lindsay and I talked about a lot in the beginning, that see what they already know, try to get a sense of what they're thinking about it before you just start offering a bunch of information. Kind of probe a little bit to see, well, what are you wondering about that? And what have you been thinking about? And can I answer some questions about it for you? See where their head is, because their questions and confusion might actually be around something totally different than you assumed. So I would be careful with, details, but again, depending on their age. If they're older, if they're in high school, they know what's going on. You might think that they don't, but they do. And even younger kids, their ability to sort of track our emotions and our distress, they know if you're having difficulties at work, if there's a chance you might lose your job, they have a sense of these things. And so I think cautious honesty is a great term, and just, again, being mindful of who your child is and their temperament. And I know for my kids, I would have those conversations in different ways because of their different personalities and what I think they could each handle. That would not be a family meeting.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So I think we probably have time maybe for one more.
Yeah, so this last one, how do I explain why we are following certain rules to my child, but why other people don't? That one's a particularly tricky one.
Well, that is a tough one, and that's one that's actually come up with us recently because, the playgrounds open back up, and everyone has different levels of risk aversion, and I'm pretty high in that risk aversion, and so I wasn't okay with us going there. And before, it's well, there's caution tape around them, so you couldn't use them. But now, kids are playing on them. So I remember my 5-year-old saying, they're playing on that. Don't they know about the virus? Maybe we should tell them about the virus. We shouldn't do that. But I think just saying, look, all families are trying to make the best decisions that they can with the information that they have. And sometimes there might be things that family has going on, or circumstances in other people's families that we don't know, that we don't understand, we are not privy to. So all we can do is just make the best decision to keep our family safe and to keep other people safe. That's kind of how I'd probably handle it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We are sadly already close to our time. And so I just want to thank you for attending. I want to also refer you back to the website. So check back in the next day or so. We should have all these resources up. We'll have the recording posted soon. One of the things we've also been doing after each of these webinars is to post reflection questions as well, because we know that many people have not been able to attend, but want to talk about these kinds of issues and questions we've been raising with other friends, parents, colleagues, family members. So please feel free to use those reflection questions, maybe have people watch the recordings, and, just build your parent community of support and talk with one another at your Zoom happy hours or in your book clubs, or, whatever the case, in those late night panicked phone calls around how some of these things are impacting you. I want to thank the National Register of Health Service Psychologists again. We're really grateful for them sponsoring us tonight. And on that note, just to let you know, if this is your first one of these webinars, thank you so much for joining us. Just to let you know that Pandemic Parenting is funded entirely by sponsorships and donations. Lindsay and I donate all of our time, but it's really important to us to be compensating all of the amazing students and early career professionals that are supporting us. And so that is what all of the donations and sponsorships go to, is to continuing to compensate our fantastic team. So special thanks on that note to Lillian for doing an excellent job moderating us tonight. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Victoria for all she is always doing for us behind the scenes. You both have been amazing the last couple weeks, especially. We really appreciate it. So please join us for our next Pandemic Parenting Exchange on September 3rd, which is called Grief, Yours, Mine, and Ours. And for that, we are very excited to be joined by internationally known child trauma expert, Dr. Margaret Blaustein. So she'll be joining us for that conversation. In the meantime, we'll be posting lots of great resources and continuing to have conversations on social media. So be sure to check out the website, follow us on social media, and sign up for future webinars. And thank you again. Please have a great next 2 weeks, and we'll see you again soon.